I still remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, though I kind of wish I didn't. My wife had been encouraging me to get out of the house, do something, maybe feel a bit more like myself again. Ever since I retired, life felt empty. After more than 30 years as a cop, I went from dealing with all kinds of rough situations every day to just nothing. The house was quiet. My days were slow, and I felt like I had no purpose. Camping sounded like a way to break that, to get out of my own head for a while, maybe find some peace. I picked a spot way out in the woods, miles from anyone else, where I wouldn't hear anything but nature. I packed light, just a tent, a flashlight, some food, the basics. I drove up north to a small lake in the woods and set up camp right by the water. It was peaceful, with the cool air and the sounds of the forest. I took a deep breath, hoping this was what I needed. The quiet out there was so thick, only broken now and then by leaves rustling or a bird calling. I thought I'd enjoy that kind of silence. But the more time passed, the stranger it felt. The quiet was too deep, like everything was holding its breath. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, wide awake in my tent, telling myself it was just the new place, the cold, maybe some leftover nerves from years on the job. But the feeling I had in my gut, that something was off, wouldn't go away. In all my years, I'd learned to trust that feeling. But I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. By the second night, that feeling had only grown. I kept hearing little noises, like sticks breaking, leaves rustling a bit too close to camp. It wasn't the usual animal sounds. I know what those sound like. This was slower, like someone creeping around, moving carefully. I stayed on edge, listening hard, eyes fixed on the edge of the trees, but I didn't see anything. Finally, I dozed off, though it wasn't real sleep, just a light, uneasy rest. But in the early hours, right before sunrise, I jolted awake, and instantly, I felt it. Something was wrong. I felt exposed, like someone had been watching me. My skin crawled, and I got up, checking my surroundings. That's when I saw them, footprints all around my tent. They circled the camp, close enough that someone had been walking there while I slept. Deep boot prints, not animal tracks, not some hiker passing through. These were fresh, and they led off into the woods, disappearing in the trees. Whoever it was had been right up on my camp, watching me. I felt a chill that ran down my spine. I'd never felt so vulnerable. I wanted to stay calm, to keep my wits about me, but my instincts were screaming to get out. I quickly packed up camp, all the while feeling like someone was watching me from the trees. Every tiny sound felt louder, like whoever had been there was still close, waiting, watching. I didn't look around. I just focused on packing and getting to my truck. Finally, I broke through the edge of the forest and saw my truck parked just where I'd left it. I felt a bit of relief, telling myself maybe I'd imagined it all, that maybe the tracks had been from an old camper who wandered by. But as I got closer, my heart dropped. Something was wrong. Right there on the hood of my truck, smeared in thick mud, was a single word, alone. I froze, staring at it. Whoever had been out there hadn't just watched. They'd followed me. They wanted me to know that out here in the deep woods, I was on my own. No help, no backup. I looked around, scanning the trees one last time, half expecting to see someone standing there, but I saw nothing. The forest was empty, just as silent as it had been before. I climbed into my truck, hands shaking, and started the engine. My heart was pounding, and I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, well out of the woods. But even then, that feeling didn't go away. I felt like someone had marked me that day, that they were out there still, knowing I'd seen their message. I haven't gone camping since. And to this day, whenever I'm alone, even in my own home, I get this feeling sometimes. It's like eyes on my back, just for a moment, reminding me of those words on my truck, reminding me that, no matter where I am, someone knows where to find me if they want to. We were deep in the forest, moving slowly and carefully through thick trees and brush, trying to stay quiet. The job was simple on paper: find and capture a wanted criminal hiding out here. He was dangerous, armed, and he knew these woods well. This part of the forest was huge and untouched, almost like it kept secrets nobody was supposed to know. Our team had set up a small, hidden camp a few miles back, near a river that gave us fresh water and some cover. At night, we only used red flashlights, keeping the beams low so we wouldn't be seen. It was pitch black under the trees, the kind of darkness where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Every sound felt louder. Every snap of a twig sounded like a warning. The forest was alive around us, animals moving in the shadows, leaves rustling, distant calls that seemed to follow us wherever we went. On the second night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I knew it wasn't just my team out there. Something else was in the woods, watching us, following our every step. I could feel eyes on me with every breath I took. By dawn, that feeling only grew. Even the air felt different, thick and heavy, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. We split up into pairs, each pair covering a different part of the area, moving slow, watching every step. My partner and I were making our way along a narrow trail when I noticed something strange. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, signs that someone had passed through recently. We followed the trail, inching forward until we came upon a small clearing. That's when I saw it. There was a small, rough shelter, barely visible in the shadows. It was hidden well, almost too well. As we got closer, I could see marks on the ground around it. Footprints, though not fresh. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, leaving behind a half-burned fire and some scraps. My gut told me this was the criminal's hideout, and he hadn't gone far. I signaled to my partner, and we started searching the area around it. We spread out, moving in a slow circle around the shelter, looking for signs of where he might have gone. Suddenly, a quick movement caught my eye, just a flicker of something in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. We kept moving, every step careful and slow, the silence pressing in on us. The forest seemed to close in, each shadow stretching longer as the day faded. Then, from somewhere close, there was a soft crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, every sense on high alert. And then I saw him. The criminal was crouched low, hiding between trees not far from us. He was watching us, eyes sharp and wild, his hands tight on a weapon. In that moment, everything felt frozen, like we were caught in some kind of standoff. I could see it in his face. He was ready to fight, and he wasn't going to be taken easily. Without a word, I backed up slowly, signaling to my partner to do the same. We moved quietly, trying not to make a sound, hoping to get enough distance to regroup with the others. But as we turned to leave, another noise came, a low, scraping sound from deeper in the shadows. I glanced back and felt a chill go through me. More figures were stepping out from the trees, rough-looking men with cold, hard eyes and weapons in hand. They weren't part of our team, and they weren't locals. In that instant, I realized this was much bigger than one criminal hiding out in the woods. This was a group, maybe even a whole ring of criminals who had set up here, and we'd walked right into their ground. They'd been watching us from the moment we entered the forest, tracking our every move, staying one step ahead. The single criminal we were after had just been bait, a way to lure us deeper in. We turned and ran, moving as fast as we could, dodging through the trees, with the sound of footsteps following close behind. Branches hit my face, and I could hear my own breath, fast and heavy. I knew we had to reach the camp, but the forest felt endless, every tree looking the same, every path starting to blur together in the fading light. When we finally broke through the trees into the clearing where our camp was, it was empty. The rest of the team was nowhere to be seen, and all our gear was gone. It was like we'd never even been there, like the forest had swallowed every trace of us. I looked at my partner, and I could see the same realization in his eyes. We were alone, and no one was coming to help us. We'd been led into a trap, far from any way out. The forest around us felt alive with silent, watching eyes, and as night fell, I felt the walls closing in, like we were animals being driven into a corner. The darkness grew thicker, and we were forced to face the truth. Out here, we were already forgotten, just like the others who had come before us. We were the next ones who would disappear into this forest, leaving nothing behind but broken branches and silent shadows. And the worst part was nobody would ever know what really happened to us. It was late September, and I decided to take my dog, Rusty, on a weekend camping trip in the mountains. The forest was thick and damp from the earlier rain, and clouds were hanging low, covering the stars and moon. By the time we set up camp, it was pitch black, and a light rain started falling again, making the ground soft and slippery with mud. We set up our tent in a small open spot surrounded by trees. The air smelled like wet leaves and dirt, and I could barely see past the small circle of light from my flashlight. Rusty, usually brave and always on alert, stayed close, his eyes darting toward every little noise in the dark. Around midnight, the rain started coming down harder, tapping against the tent in a steady rhythm. I was starting to doze off when Rusty suddenly tensed up, staring toward the edge of the trees and letting out a low growl. I picked up my flashlight and aimed it in the direction he was watching, but all I saw were thick, dark branches. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but Rusty wouldn't settle. He kept growling, his eyes fixed on that one spot. A few minutes passed, and I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. I thought Rusty would calm down, but his growl turned into a full, deep bark. His gaze was locked on the same place, just outside the light, and my heart started racing. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a small knife, and peeked out of the tent. The rain had eased up a little, but thick fog was rolling in, sticking close to the ground. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any noise, but all I could hear was the sound of water dripping from the leaves. Still, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake this feeling creeping up my spine. Then I heard it, a slow, heavy crunch of footsteps on the wet ground. They were slow and steady, coming closer, one step at a time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. I scanned the trees with the flashlight but saw nothing. Rusty's barking grew louder and more panicked, his body tense, his fur standing up. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who or what was out there. I quickly grabbed my bag, stuffed everything into it as best I could, and pulled up the tent stakes. We'd packed light, so we were ready to move within minutes. Rusty stayed close to me as I tried to find our way out, his barking turning into a low, steady growl. As we walked, I kept hearing the sound of those footsteps behind us. They'd stop whenever we stopped, just far enough that I couldn't see anything, like someone was keeping pace with us. I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't follow you like that. This felt different, like we were being watched, tracked. We kept moving through the thick fog, trying to stay on what I thought was the trail back to my truck. But with every step, it felt like we were getting farther away, like the forest was swallowing us up. I started to wonder if we were just walking in circles, getting more lost by the second. My nerves were shot, and Rusty was now walking close to my side, no longer barking, just letting out a small whimper now and then. After what felt like hours, I finally caught a glimpse of something metal through the trees. The truck. I nearly ran the last few steps, Rusty right by my side. I yanked open the door, letting Rusty jump in first, then climbed in and slammed the door shut. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the forest. As I backed up to turn around, my headlights swept over the trees one last time. For a split second, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, half hidden behind a tree. It was a person, completely still, drenched in the rain, just watching us. Their eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, almost like they'd been waiting for us to leave. I hit the gas and sped down the mountain road, not looking back again. I drove until the forest was far behind us, but that feeling didn't go away. It stuck with me, the sense that we'd been followed, watched. Even now, I can't shake it. Sometimes, when I'm out late or walking through a dark place, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same figure watching me. And every now and then, Rusty still tenses up at night, staring at the shadows by the window, growling at something only he can see. I went camping with a few friends in a forest far from any town. It was a place none of us had been to, but we'd heard it was beautiful and untouched, with no trails or signs of people around. The plan was to get away from everything for a bit, just relax by the fire and enjoy nature. The first day went smoothly. We set up our tents, collected firewood, and spent the evening cooking and chatting by the fire. It was quiet, no other campers, just the sound of the wind in the trees and small animals scurrying through the bushes. By nightfall, it got cold, so I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay down to sleep. I was just starting to doze off when I felt something lightly brush against my ankle. At first, I thought it might be a thread or maybe a bug. I was about to brush it off, but when I moved, I felt something smooth and cold tighten a little around my leg. Suddenly, I realized that this was no loose thread or bug. I froze, barely breathing, as I felt the thing in my sleeping bag shift a bit, heavy and long. As I moved just slightly, it coiled tighter, wrapping around my leg. My heart was pounding hard, and my mind raced. I couldn't see it, but I didn't need to. I knew what it was. I'd heard stories of campers finding snakes in their tents, and we were far from any help. I knew one bite could be enough to end it all out here. I lay there, barely breathing, afraid to make the slightest move. My leg was starting to go numb from how tightly it was coiled around me. Every tiny shift I made seemed to make it grip even tighter, wrapping itself slowly but firmly around my leg. I knew I had two options: stay completely still and hope it wouldn't bite, or try to ease out of the sleeping bag and risk making it attack. I decided to wait. I told myself that snakes usually bite only when they feel threatened. Time dragged by as I lay there, counting every second, each shallow breath. My body was aching from staying so still, but I couldn't risk it. I just lay there, trying to keep my breath shallow, praying that it would leave. Finally, I felt it start to loosen just a little. Slowly, it relaxed its grip on my leg. I stayed frozen, hardly daring to breathe, until I felt it fully unwind and slide down my leg. I waited until I was sure it was gone, then unzipped my tent and crawled out as quietly as I could, my whole body tense with fear. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat by the fire, watching the woods around me as the first light of dawn crept over the trees. My leg was sore and marked where it had been wrapped, and my mind couldn't stop running through what might have happened if I'd moved too fast or startled it. In the morning, as the light hit, I found a faint track leading away from my tent, showing where it had slithered off. I quickly started packing up, not caring if my friends asked questions. They saw my face and started packing too. We didn't talk much, each of us feeling the unease in the air, looking down with every step, expecting something to move. As we left, I realized something that I hadn't wanted to face out there in the dark. That snake hadn't just been passing through my tent by accident. No, it had been there for warmth, lying against me like I was part of its territory. I'd thought it was a lucky escape, but as I walked away, I kept thinking, what if it came back? What if it decided that warmth was worth hunting down? Even now, lying in bed at home, I feel a prickling on my leg, remembering that cold, heavy grip. And I know deep down that in the middle of the night, far out in the wild, there's no such thing as luck, only what the forest chooses to let you walk away with. Jack was a friend of my dad's, a real outdoors guy who'd been camping and fishing his whole life. When he invited me to go camping, I felt excited but a little uneasy. Jack wasn't the friendly, cheerful type. He was more serious and no nonsense, and he wasn't the kind to slow down for anyone. So I knew I'd have to keep up. We set off for a remote part of the woods where he swore the fishing was good, and the campsites were quiet. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally reached the spot he'd chosen. It was deep in the forest, far from any trails, and surrounded by thick trees and bushes. Out there, it was so quiet that you could barely hear anything but the wind and the occasional rustling. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and spent most of the day fishing at a stream nearby. Jack barely spoke, totally focused on his fishing, and I just followed his lead, getting used to the stillness around us. When the sun started going down, we cooked the fish we'd caught over the fire and ate in silence. The quiet was starting to feel almost normal, and I was beginning to feel more relaxed. After dinner, Jack told me to make sure my tent was zipped up tight before we went to sleep, which I did. I got into my sleeping bag and lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. Leaves moving in the wind, insects chirping, and once in a while, a branch cracking somewhere off in the dark. At some point in the middle of the night, a strange noise snapped me awake. It was a slow, steady crunching sound, like someone was carefully stepping on dried leaves and twigs. At first, I thought it might be Jack, but the footsteps sounded careful, like they were trying not to be noticed. I lay completely still, barely breathing, listening as the sound got louder, then stopped right outside my tent. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears as I stared at the thin walls of my tent, waiting to see a shadow or something move. But there was nothing, just complete silence and an eerie feeling that someone was right outside, watching. After what felt like forever, I finally managed to pull the zipper open just a tiny bit to peek outside. In the dim moonlight, I could make out Jack's tent across from mine, undisturbed. No one was there, no signs of anything strange, just the sound of leaves rustling lightly in the breeze. I forced myself to believe it was probably just some animal and tried to fall back asleep, though I barely closed my eyes for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jack was sitting by the fire, calm as ever. He didn't say anything strange, and I didn't bring up what I'd heard. I didn't want to seem paranoid. We packed up and went back to the stream for another day of fishing. But as we walked down, I noticed something odd, footprints in the soft dirt along the path. They were definitely human but didn't belong to either of us. The tracks looked strange, as if whoever left them had been moving carefully, stepping lightly. I tried to brush off the feeling crawling over me, but I couldn't shake it. Even as we fished, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like there was someone watching from the trees. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I saw Jack's eyes moving over the tree line more than once, but he never said anything. When evening rolled around, Jack suggested we pack up and head back to the car instead of spending another night out there. He didn't explain, and I didn't question it. We packed up quickly, hiking back in complete silence. When we finally reached the edge of the trail, close to the car, I felt a wave of relief. But just as we were about to get in, something made me look back. There, standing in the shadows of the trees, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure. They were wearing dark, torn-up clothes, and they blended almost completely into the trees. But what I could see were their eyes, locked on us, unblinking, just watching. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, as if waiting for something. Jack didn't look back. He tossed our gear in the car and motioned for me to get in. As we drove away, I kept my eyes on that figure until the trees finally hid them. Jack kept his mouth shut the entire ride back, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I never talked to Jack or my dad about that camping trip. Part of me wondered if Jack had seen the figure too, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Whatever was out there, it didn't feel like we were supposed to see it, like maybe we'd accidentally walked into a place we didn't belong. To this day, I can still picture that figure in the shadows, just standing there. It felt like a warning, something telling me that some places, some people are better left alone. And every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, I get that same feeling, like someone's watching from the trees, waiting, and I know it's time to leave before they step any closer. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my grandmother, and my grandfather camping at the same spot we'd been to so many times before. It was always peaceful, a break from the noise and rush of the world, the sound of the fire crackling, the fresh air, and the quiet that came with being out in nature. I always looked forward to it. We set up camp near the lake just like we always did. The spot was tucked between a few trees, and the water was only a short walk away. It was one of those cool, clear evenings where everything felt still, too still. My grandparents got to work making their usual campfire stew while I walked around, stretching my legs after the long drive. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting a golden glow over everything, and everything felt like it always did, until it didn't. As night fell, I noticed something strange. There was a noise coming from the trees, not the wind, but a soft rustling. It wasn't normal. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then, I heard it again, this time much closer. It sounded like someone was walking through the leaves, crunching them with every step. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the campfire, trying not to let my grandparents see that I was bothered. They were busy talking and cooking, not paying any attention. But the noise didn't stop. Now, it was clearly footsteps, slow, careful, almost like they were trying not to be heard, moving around our camp. My skin crawled. I looked around the trees, trying to see something, anything, but all I saw were shadows. The only sound was the soft hum of my grandmother near the fire. Then I felt it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was a feeling like someone was watching me, studying me. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen. Then the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. The silence stretched on and on. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure, just a shape in the darkness, standing near the edge of the trees. At first, it was just a shadow so faint I wasn't sure I saw it at all. But then it moved, just a little, like it was turning to face me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was a person. I felt my heart race. The figure didn't move forward. It just stayed there, staring. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes off it. My instincts told me to run, but I stayed put, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, never blinking, never looking away. I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing down on me, but I couldn't look away. My whole body screamed at me to go, but I couldn't make myself move. It wasn't until what felt like an eternity that the figure finally turned and walked off into the trees. Couldn't breathe. I didn't know if I should run or stay, but all I could do was stare at the darkness where it had disappeared. It wasn't until later that I realized what really scared me. It wasn't just that there was someone out there. It was that they had been completely silent. Not a single branch snapped under their feet. Not even a leaf crunched. They had moved like a shadow, and I hadn't heard a thing until they were already close. I didn't say anything to my grandparents. They were already asleep, unaware of the strange thing I'd just seen. But all night, I lay awake, listening to every sound in the woods, convinced that someone, or something, was out there. I kept hearing small rustling sounds, like someone walking around just beyond the campfire light, but I never saw anything again. I couldn't sleep, not with that feeling of being watched. In the morning, I didn't want to stick around any longer. I told my grandparents I wasn't feeling well, and we packed up and left early, my grandparents still completely unaware of what had happened. Years later, I returned to that same lake. The trees were still there, the water still as calm as I remembered, but something was different. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a while, staring at the trees, feeling the same fear creep up my spine, the same sense that something was waiting just out of sight. The place had changed, but the feeling hadn't. As the evening grew darker, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had been out there that night, all those years ago, was still out there, watching, waiting, and I wasn't so sure that it was something I could escape. It was a quiet night at the police training camp, about a few miles outside the city. A group of us had set up tents for some night exercises. The forest around us was thick, with trees so dense they blocked most of the moonlight, casting everything in shadow. The air was cold, and all I could hear were the sounds of the fire crackling and the occasional chirp from distant animals. We'd spent the day doing various drills, and now it was time for a night exercise. This one was about tracking and moving quietly through the woods. I was paired up with a few other officers to find a suspect who had a head start. Our instructor, an experienced officer, had warned us that the exercise wouldn't be easy. We had to catch the suspect without making a sound and without disturbing the forest. We split up and moved slowly through the trees, making sure to keep our flashlights off. We had to rely on our instincts and the dim light from the stars above. The instructor had told us that things wouldn't always go as planned, but I didn't think much of it. To me, it was just another training session. As we moved deeper into the woods, I started feeling like something was off. It was as if someone was watching us. I kept looking behind me, but there was nothing there. I ignored the feeling and focused on the task. We were supposed to look for signs of the suspect, broken branches, footprints, anything that would lead us in the right direction. But as we walked, I noticed there were fewer and fewer signs. About an hour into the search, I saw something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, but they weren't from the suspect. These were smaller, almost like children's footprints. My heart started to race. I was trained for this kind of work, but this felt wrong. I radioed my team, but the radio didn't work. I tried again, but nothing came through. I decided to follow the footprints, my mind racing with questions. We were far from any roads, deep in the woods, and no one was supposed to be out here. My flashlight barely lit up the ground in front of me. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of insects and animals were gone, and it felt like the world around me had gone completely still. Then, I heard a rustle from behind a nearby bush. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen closely. There was another rustle, this time much closer. I lifted my flashlight, but when the beam hit the spot where I heard the noise, there was nothing there, just trees and thick underbrush. I stepped back, feeling uneasy, and turned to head back to my team. But then, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing still in the shadows. It was tall, way too tall to be one of my team members. Panic shot through me. My training kicked in, and I grabbed my radio again, but all I heard was static, with faint, broken words that I couldn't understand. I didn't waste any more time. I needed to get back to camp. Fast. As I turned to run, I could feel something behind me. It was too close now. The rustling sounds were growing louder, and the air felt heavier with each step I took. My flashlight flickered, and I struggled to keep the beam steady. I was breathing hard, my legs burning from the effort, but I kept running, not daring to look back. The figure I had seen earlier was still there, but it wasn't moving like a person anymore. It was too fast, too quick, like it was closing in on me. I crashed through the underbrush, my foot catching on branches and roots. I finally burst through into the clearing where the camp was set up. My team was standing by the fire, just as I had left them. They hadn't moved an inch. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure behind me, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadow. It was as if whatever it was had never been there at all. I tried to shake it off. It was just a trick of the mind, I thought, just stress from the exercise. But something didn't sit right. I couldn't ignore the feeling of being followed. The next morning, when we gathered to go over the exercise, I told the instructor about what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and told us to stay sharp. The mind can play tricks out here, he said, but I didn't believe him. I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't just in my head. Later, as we were packing up to leave, I walked to the edge of the camp, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I saw them, small footprints in the dirt, leading into the woods. They were fresh, like someone had just walked through, and they were too small to be from any of my team. They led right into the trees, exactly where I had been running the night before. My blood ran cold as I stared at the footprints. They weren't a part of the training. They weren't part of the exercise. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe someone else had been out there, but the feeling that had crept into me the night before came rushing back. The woods weren't just quiet. They were waiting for something or someone to walk through them again. Something that might not be human. I left that day without saying another word, but as we drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, and I knew, deep down, that whatever it was in those woods wasn't finished with me yet.